we live in a world and we live in an environment that there's tons of pathogens out there that could get you sick. A pathogen could be something like a bacteria you could get from food poisoning. It could be E. coli on your skin. It could be staphylococcus behind the ears. It can also be some of these non-living chemicals or non-living fragments of DNA, RNA called viruses, right? So you hear about the COVID, SARS-CoV-2 virus. You hear about the influenza virus. You hear about all kinds of viruses. And whenever something that comes into our body and it can trigger sickness or it can disrupt the homeostasis of our body, it's going to cause disease, right? And this is a perfect segue for your clinical project, because I want you to find some disease or disorder that you might be interested about or something that you saw in my video and just expand on it. I want you to do some research, write about it, tell us about some of the pathology behind it and some treatment options, and of course, at least knowing some information about that condition. So when a pathogen comes into your body, you'll see that there's two arrows. These arrows represents how your body reacts to it. So one way is that the pathogen can produce something called antigens, which are little proteins that your body will then pick up. The other way that your body can pick this up is, let's say the pathogen comes in and it releases toxins or some kind of disrupting signal that will be virulent and cause damage to the body, and now your body is exposed. So when a vaccine that is created by a company, whatever type of vaccine we're talking about, mRNA vaccine or traditional adenovirus vaccine, all these vaccines are they take some part of this virulent pathogen, whether it be the toxin over here on the right hand side or the antigen on the left hand side, and they introduce that to the body. You can introduce it many ways. Like the mRNA will make the cells generate the own antigens, but the whole point is to generate an opportunity for the body to see what this virulent pathogen is so that you don't get disease, right? We don't want to get disease. So you get vaccinated, and let's say you go through your life and now all of a sudden you do encounter a patient. So Stephanie, you're working in a hospital and you do encounter a patient that has COVID and they coughed, and for some reason your mask wasn't sealed properly and some of that particle got into your body and now you start getting sick. So because you got vaccinated, you have what we call the active immunity, which is the ability for your body to have seen that target, and you can generate antibodies within several hours. It's a matter of about 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, you can generate enough antibodies to begin fighting that off. Versus if you didn't have this and you just naturally got exposed, this might take almost 1 to 2 weeks, right? So there's like a big difference in time in when you can actually begin fighting that virus off. And so if you have the vaccine and if you have active immunity healthy and working, theoretically, you really won't get much disease, right? Because you fight it off so quickly that it's not really there. So that's really the way that vaccines work, and this is how getting that boost is really valuable, right? But obviously it's not perfect because vaccines have a duration that they're effective. So the first response that our body generates is called a primary response. This is going to be whenever you get infected by any kind of virus or bacteria or any kind of pathogen from our environment. It takes about 5 to maybe 10 days before you even begin having detectable antibodies inside our blood. So that means it's about a week of time, like a little bit over a week to a little bit under 2 weeks of time that your body begins to really fight off that bad thing. And during that 5 to 10 days, I want to ask you all this question. If you're somebody that's really, really old, or if you have comorbidities, or if you have genetic inherited disorders, or if you have diabetes, cancer, HIV, an organ transplant, any of those people that I just said, do you think they could survive the 10 days? Right? So that's the question. Number 2 is then during that 10 days, if you're healthy and young, chances are you probably will, right? So that's the dilemma. It's like young people, 5 days before antibodies, you'll survive. But if you are at a certain risk level, then you might not. The secondary response is what happens after you get vaccinated or after you get exposed to the COVID and then you survive. So basically at a later exposure, your ability to generate those antibodies is less than 2 hours. So you might have maybe 1 hour that you feel kind of like, I feel kind of a little bit out of it. I feel a little bit not all there. I don't feel all homeostatic. But after that 2 hours, you should be able to feel a lot better and feel a lot more recovered. All right, so that's the two kind of responses that your immune system can generate. So this is a graph that I can show you. This basically is very generic, but it applies to most of the primary and secondary responses. So we're not just talking about COVID, we're talking about in general how your body behaves, right? Because most of our understanding of vaccines and viruses is based on just theory, right? It's how theory works, and theory guides what we can talk about and what we believe works. So the way this works is, let's say you have never ever seen COVID and you got COVID the first time. Now, let's say you got exposed to COVID right here. About week 1 into it, you start generating antibodies. So you can see it goes all the way from nothing all the way up to here, right? So you gain a good amount of antibodies between the first and second week. And then another week goes along, you make a little bit more antibodies, and by about week 4, or 1 month in, your body has generated all the antibodies it can do to fight off the virus, right? And so you need to survive this entire length of time from 0 to 4 before your body can fight. Well, if you get a booster shot, if you get a vaccine, what you're doing is you're getting this entire graph to become like the red graph. So instead of having this long 4-week time, you start off literally almost at this point rather than at that point, right? So you get that much more antibodies of fighting power versus that much, and it takes 4 weeks, right? So you tell me which one is a better deal. Do you want to be able to fight the virus 4 weeks later with half the amount of firepower, or do you want to be able to fight the virus literally within a matter of hours and be able to respond, right? So that's really why having the second shot and why efficacy studies are so powerful. But unfortunately, because nothing is perfect, after about 6 months, 7 months, there has been shown to be a decay in your ability to generate antibodies. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. So there's this very big theory, and I want to get you to think about how this works. You probably heard about antibodies, you probably heard about B cells, T cells, but the theory behind this is called a clonal selection theory. And this is a theory because this is not 100%. It's not 100% because there's still research governing this, but this is the widely accepted theory of how the B cells work. So most of us, you're going to have inherited genes from your mom and dad, right? And then you have kids, the kids will have your genes, and so on and so forth. Most of our genes in our DNA code for different kinds of antibodies. They code for different cells that can make antibodies. So you inherit pretty much almost all of these different kinds of lymphocytes from your mom and dad. And then those cells are going to then choose what kind of antibodies get produced based on what is exposed to the body. So your whole body is basically this system of waiting to see what comes in and then responding by making the protein. That's how our bodies work. So let's just say you get sick, right? So you get sick, COVID comes in, this foreign particle called COVID comes along, SARS-CoV-2 gets into your body, and your immune system begins by responding by making many copies, and it starts duplicating, and now it happens mostly inside the lymphatic tissue. So your lymph nodes, your spleen, your thymus, and during that time you produce what they call a clone. A clone is a backup version of that first kind of cell. And I'll show you a picture that will make more sense. As that happens, the B cells begin to go through tons and tons of mutation to generate every antibody possible in the body until that antibody can bind specifically to the SARS-CoV-2 protein. So this is why it takes about 1 to 2 weeks. It takes time for your cells to keep on dividing and releasing protein and doing all this stuff back and forth until you actually make the right antibody that has the highest affinity, the strongest binding power to the antigen. And once it finds that one, all the other cells are going to be broken down, and that B cell stays intact, and then that becomes a memory so that you've seen it. So this is how the body forms that memory. Okay, it sounds really crazy because it's almost like your body is like a scanner, and it scans for the pathogen, and once it scans it, it knows how to make the right target or right mold. And so this whole theory is what governs our secondary response, and this is why vaccines do their job. So the secondary response, number one, is always going to produce a much more massive response in the first one, and then it's always going to be faster. So that's why getting the vaccine has its benefits, is that if you were to be exposed, you won't get really that sick, right? But there are always, unfortunate outliers to that scenario where you could still get something very, very unfortunate. So this is just a picture to show you this, and I want you to think about it. So you start off on first day. So day one, let's say you get infected by a virus. You have this one little cell, one B cell, that divides to two. And then two of these B cells are then selected against each other, and then now you can see they divide another round. But out of these four cells, these two on the far left are non-useful because they don't make the right antibody, so they get destroyed. And then of those four, only these first two on the far right here, 1 and 2, are going to have the opportunity to go on. So now day 2, they divide and they make another 4 cells. And then these two so happen to not do anything, and these two are good, and it goes on and on. So this process of selection takes time. And what people don't realize and you don't talk about, and if you don't have and this is why not everybody has taken physiology, not everybody has a background in biotechnology or biology, and nor immunology. And so if you don't know the science behind it, when you explain to somebody, hey, do vaccines work, or the vaccines not do anything, is it going to get me sick? There's theory behind that governs it. Once you understand it, that's the whole point. And so the whole point of a vaccine is to be able to reduce this time it takes for your body to get to day 5 right here and get those B cells and memory cells and making the antibodies a lot faster.